Good afternoon, and welcome to our second session of Inspiring Biodiversity in Our Gardens. Today's session is titled Honeybees and Native Bees, What You Don't Know, and will feature presentations by Dr. David Peck and Sam Droege. I am Renee Baranka, the Director of Conservation Education and Outreach at Western Reserve Land Conservancy. The Land Conservancy is Ohio's largest land trust, encompassing a 29-county region in Northeast Ohio, and to date, we have protected over 75,000 acres of natural lands, family farms, and urban green spaces. At the Land Conservancy, I plan nature-based programming for people of all ages. Our goal is to provide a platform to learn and develop a greater appreciation of our natural world. I am pleased to continue our collaboration with the Cleveland Pollinator and Native Plant Symposium and Nature Spark to bring you our annual Biodiversity Symposium. Through this collaboration, we hope to have an impact in transforming gardens and green spaces into functioning, diverse, beneficial habitats. My co-hosts, Ann Cicerella and Judy Semrek, are passionate about this topic. Ann is the founder of the Cleveland Pollinator and Native Plant Symposium. She works to build connections and encourage conversations about the importance of restoring our fragmented native habitats, starting with our own backyards and local community gardens. Ann is responsible for our amazing lineup of speakers. She stays on top of relevant topics and watches hours of presentations to create a meaningful program that, with once again having over 1,000 registrants for today's session, must resonate with our audience. Judy possesses a wealth of knowledge about our natural world. Through her company, Nature Spark, she works with children and adults in the realm of nature education and exploration. She loves to share her nature knowledge through both field trips and public programs. I thank them both for sponsoring as well as planning and promoting this series with me. I enjoy moderating these webinars, which feature national and regional experts to increase our collective awareness about pollinators, native plants, and planting designs. We hope you'll stay engaged and join us for our next two sessions. Due to availability, session 3 will be live tomorrow afternoon, January 30th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll feature Dr. Jared Barnes for his program, How to Use the Science of Plant Survival Strategies for a Healthier Garden. Please note that Dr. Barnes has asked not to be recorded, so session 3 will only be available live. And on Wednesday, February 12th, we'll welcome landscape architect Preston Montague for his program, Composition Tips for Wilder Gardens. Remember, you need to register for each session individually. Now, I'd like to take a moment and recognize and thank our sponsors who have made it possible for us to bring you this symposium. Thank you to the Ohio Division of Wildlife, Audubon Society of Greater Cleveland, Avonlea Gardens, Biodiversity and Landscape Design, New Vista, Lake Erie Allegheny Partnership, Leaves for Wildlife, Meadow City Nursery, Natives in Harmony, and Ohio Prairie Nursery. And remember, please use the Q&A feature to post your questions. We'll pause for a few if time permits following each presentation. Now on to our show. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Peck for his program, The Collective Intelligence of the Honeybee, Exploring Their Symbolic Communication. Welcome, Dr. Peck.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be invited, and I hope I can be heard clearly, and if not, let me know.
Absolutely, it sounds great.
I have too many slides than the time allotted, so I might as well jump right into it, and hopefully I won't have to cut much out.
Sounds great.
Bear with me just one moment, everyone. I'll get this all pulled up, and we should be ready to go. If I do this, and then this, and then this, and then that, I believe you should see the correct thing.
It looks great. Looking good.
All right, then let's get ourselves going. So, my name is David Peck. I'm the Director of Research and Education at a company called Betterbee in upstate New York that makes and distributes beekeeping equipment and beekeeping education around the country. This is a talk that I'm really excited to give, which is really a celebration of the extraordinary capacity of honeybees. And I'm going to be talking about honeybees because they're the bees that I have the most expertise in, but they are really just one example of the extraordinary capacities that these pollinating insects have to do what they need to do to survive and thrive. So this talk is about the honeybee dance language. And this is a language that it actually took our species thousands of years to decode and interpret. But it's really, even more than that, an exploration of this idea of collective intelligence. How can a bunch of bugs do something that is pretty remarkably intelligent? How can a group of bugs working together be smarter than any one insect is capable of being? So to begin this lecture about dancing, maybe we should just look at the phenomenon of dancing more broadly. A lot of us, especially those of us with kids, pay a lot of money and spend a lot of time to get our kids taught how to dance by someone. But the question of how to dance is in some ways less interesting to me than why we dance. Why do we engage in these crazy gyrations? Why would you do something like this? Why would you put yourself at risk of bodily injury from slipping and falling just to gyrate in a certain way? What is the function of the behavior? What does it achieve? What is its purpose for the animal that does it? And this is the question that I answer as a behavioral biologist about any behavior that I'm interested in. So if we look at human dancing, we can look at it as a performance art. We can look at it as an athletic event. In the case of the Maasai in East Africa, this is their traditional Adumu dance. Here I have an animation of it, which is a jumping-based dance that young men do. Why do they do it? Why do they try to jump higher than the next guy? Well, it might help you to learn that the guy who can jump the tallest tends to wind up with the prettiest girlfriend in the village. That's why you want to do this. It's to show off. This is a very different kind of dancing. These are whirling dervishes from the Islamic world, and these are men who are engaging in this dance-like behavior as part of a meditative and religious trance. This is a social dance. This is a contra dance up here in New England, where I currently live, and this is an activity for folks to get together and dance collectively as a community. You can even win college scholarships for competitive ballroom dancing if you're good enough at it. So there's a lot of reasons for humans to engage in these crazy gyrations. But one thing that you might have noticed if you've ever found yourself in traffic behind the car of a dancer is that there's an awful lot of bumper stickers that will encourage you to dance like nobody's watching. But the reality is that almost never happens. Human dancing typically has an audience. When I'm dancing, it's dancing in front of you who are watching me dance. And by doing that, it opens up this opportunity for dance to be a form of communication. It's a way for me to communicate some message, some idea, some feeling to you through my body motion. And that can take a wide range of forms. You can look at very abstract forms of interpretive dance, things that might be a little too difficult for even the best of us to fully interpret. You can look at something a little more explicit, like a ballet performance. This is a performance of Swan Lake, where the dance is used to tell the story. And you can even look at perhaps the best elaborated form of this in our species, which is Polynesian hula dancing, where the specific vocabulary of the dance has been developed over time, and it can be interpreted by those watching it to have very specific meanings. So humans have elaborated extensively upon this idea of dancing, but we are not the first species to do it. This is one of our cousins, a gorilla, who is dancing like nobody's watching, but he doesn't know that there's a video camera here watching him. This is what I would have to guess is dance for play purposes. This is a very famous cockatoo named Snowball, you may have seen online. He likes to dance to 90s pop tunes like Britney Spears that his owner plays for him. And he's a male cockatoo, and he's doing this because rhythmic dancing and display is a good way for male cockatoos to display that they aren't full of parasites or sickly to the female cockatoos around them. And so this rhythmic dancing is another way to get a girlfriend. The same is true for this bird of paradise, who is dancing and trying to attract a mate in the same way. And it's not even just vertebrates that do this. This is an arthropod. This is a peacock jumping spider, and he is dancing to try to get himself a girlfriend and hope that he doesn't eat her at the end of the mating process, or rather that she doesn't eat him. So there's a lot of different reasons to dance. There's a lot of different functions that dancing can have. And it's a very interesting range of behaviors that are often less studied than other behaviors in animal biology. But this brings me to the species that I'd like to focus on for my talk, and that is honeybees. Honeybees have an extraordinary ability to communicate through dance. And I'm going to tell you a few stories that will eventually get us to an understanding of how that dance language works and what it allows honeybees to do. But to get there, I actually need to tell you another story. And that story begins with a hummingbird feeder. You see, I have a PhD in honeybee behavior, but while I was earning that PhD at Cornell, my wife was just down the road at the psychology department at Cornell getting a PhD in bird behavior. So we've heard all the birds and the bees jokes that you can think of. But because I try to be a good husband, I bought her a hummingbird feeder and I hung it outside her office window so that she could look at the hummingbirds while she was writing her dissertation. And so I hung the hummingbird feeder up, I filled it with sugar water, and we looked out all day and no hummingbirds showed up. And then we looked out the next day and no hummingbirds showed up. And the next day and still no hummingbirds. And we went out the next day and it was covered in honeybees. It was absolutely swarmed with them. And it wasn't just one or two bees. It was clear that one bee had discovered this thing and somehow had communicated to all of the other bees in her community how to get to this wonderful, wonderful bright red food source that I had put out in this sort of cheap and leaky hummingbird feeder. I've since bought my wife a better hummingbird feeder that the bees can't get to. But how did this happen? How was it that these honeybees were able to discover this food in this vast landscape that they were exploring and then come to exploit it so quickly and so efficiently? Well, honeybees have a challenge that they need to overcome. And that challenge is finding food in a landscape that is sometimes pretty hostile to pollinating insects. We like to think that the world looks something like this. We think that landscapes are just flowers and nature and bounty for all of the creatures to profit from. But that's not really how things work. In reality, bees face challenging landscapes all the time because those landscapes tend to be very, very patchy. They have patches of good food resources, good flowers that provide lots of forage for them, and patches that have very little food for them. And it's even more difficult because those flowers don't just appear in the spring and disappear come winter. Instead, flowers might be there for a month or two, and then some of them will fade, and another flower might bloom for a week or even just a matter of a few days, and then those flowers will fade, and then as time wears on, we would expect to see yet more flowers emerge. And so these bees have to navigate this incredibly difficult and ever-changing floral landscape, and they need to figure out where to go so that they can get the resources that they need to reproduce and to survive, and they need to make sure that they're allocating their workforce efficiently. There's a lot of bees in that hive, and that means that if you mobilize them well, you can hit these flower patches hard, you can get lots of resources from them, you can be very, very efficient. But if you don't mobilize them well, you've got a lot of hungry mouths to feed and maybe not enough food coming in to feed them. So this is just a graph that illustrates this idea that honeybees throughout a typical year are going to go through these booms and busts in the availability of food. So this is a graph that shows on the vertical axis the daily change in the weight of a honeybee colony that was put on a scale. So if the bar goes up above this line, that means that the colony gained weight that day. If it goes down below the line, it means that they lost weight that day. And what we can see is that in this particular case, where the colony was measured from May through July, there were these periodic spikes that we've labeled things like dandelion and black locust, because those are the flowers that were blooming most pointedly at those times. But in between these peaks, there are also these valleys that follow, these periods of time where the bees are losing weight every day because there just isn't that much food coming in for them. One key principle that we learn from studying the way bees relate to their landscape is that monocultures of plants typically hurt bees. That's certainly true if you plant something like wheat, which bees can't really get very much from because these grains are wind pollinated. They're not producing nectar, so the bees can't get much food from them. But even if the plant that you plant in this massive landscape covering monoculture is good for bees, even if I had tens of thousands of acres of sunflowers, which are really good and nutritionally beneficial for bees, we need diversity for these bees to be healthy. And so unless it is an animal that is specialized to feed on nothing but sunflowers and can really focus on it and exploit nothing but those floral resources, they're going to suffer if they don't have food diversity. And in the case of honeybees, the terminology we use is that we would get one good honey flow from a monoculture of a good crop like sunflowers. The bees would get as much as they possibly could while the flowers are blooming. And as soon as those flower blooms start to fade, the bees would drop off and spend the rest of the year losing weight every single day, eating through the honey that they had stored and waiting for the next big score, which in the case of that monoculture would require them waiting all the way through until the sunflowers bloom the following year. Now, I've been talking about the way that bees explore and exploit the food in their landscape, but it's important to understand just how wide-ranging a honeybee colony can be. And so to do that, it's maybe helpful to scale the foraging range of a honeybee to the foraging range that we would expect if they were the size of a human being. Excuse me. So if we figure that the average honeybee is about 15 millimeters long, and we say that the average human is maybe 5.4 feet tall. We'll be a little conservative there. And we convert that to millimeters. We know that honeybees are able to forage up to 10 kilometers away from their hive. That's not typical, but they can do that if they need to, if there's not food any closer than that. They can go even further. So if we do a little bit of back of the envelope math, we can calculate that the human-sized bee that would be foraging from, let's say, a hive in Detroit, Michigan, is going to have a range that goes more than 1,000 kilometers around them. That means that these Detroit-based human bees would be flying from Omaha, Nebraska to Boston, Massachusetts, and from Atlanta all the way up to the southern tip of James Bay in Canada. So for the size of these bees, they are exploring an absolutely astronomical scale of space around them. So their ability to do this is remarkable, but it means that they have to be able to send that massive and very capable workforce in the right location. How do other bees do this? Is the stuff that I'm going to tell you about honeybees true of most bee species? No, it actually isn't. So this is just one bee that I'll pick on. This is a bumblebee here. And many bumblebees live in communal nests like honeybees do. They live in nests that are headed by one large mother queen that have female workers, that have some males whose only purpose is to go off and try to find a girlfriend. But the bumblebees that live in these colonies, and this is a commercially available bumblebee hive, they aren't capable of recruiting each other to flower patches. They're not capable of doing the same thing that my bees did at that hummingbird feeder. And this idea of recruitment is something that has puzzled humans for a very long time. In about more than 2 millennia ago, about 2.5 millennia ago, Aristotle wrote a book on animals. He tried to write everything that was known about every animal species. And when he wrote about honeybees, he noted a number of facts, but two of them were that bees recruit each other to specific food sources. And he also observed bees making dancing or dance-like movements. But he didn't connect those two observations. Those were just two of a number of observations that Aristotle made. Those dance-like motions that he described can be observed, and I've got a video of it right here that you can look at. There's one bee right here in the middle of the screen, and if we look closely at her, we can see that she is running and dancing and sort of being jostled by the bees that are watching her dance. But she's running, sort of buzzing off to the left, and then she turns to the right, runs around, makes a figure eight. She buzzes to the left again. She turns to the left and continues that figure eight, and then continues this run on and on and on. So this is a bee who's engaged in these sort of repeatable, predictable gyrations. That video and many of the other videos and images I'm going to show you today, I have to give credit to my doctoral advisor, Tom Seeley, for. This is a picture of him studying honeybees in Maine. I also need to thank him for the great research that he has done and also his mentorship of me as a scientist and as a beekeeper. But this story does not begin with Tom. It is actually a story that requires us to go a little bit further back in my scientific pedigree. So this is Carl von Frisch. He was the scientist who finally cracked the code of how these honeybees were recruiting each other. He began his work in 1919, and in 1973, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for his work on honeybee dance language. I have to resign myself to the fact that they're probably not going to be giving out any more Nobel Prizes for honeybee behavior for a while, so I'm probably never going to get one. But I can take some solace in the fact that Herr Dr. Professor von Frisch is my doctoral advisor's doctoral advisor's doctoral advisor's doctoral advisor, which makes him my academic great-great-grandfather. So at least I have a good pedigree behind me. What von Frisch and his students did was that they trained honeybees to go to feeders full of sugar water. At first, he thought that the bees were just using odor. They were using the scents of flowers to find food. Excuse me. So that's what he intended to study. But they started paying close attention to the fact that these bees were dancing as they returned from their foraging trips. And the dances that they were looking at were very precise. They had a varied tempo, they had varied direction, but each bee was being very specific about what she was doing. And so as they studied and as they learned and as they questioned and as they tested, they were able to discover, forgive me, that these bees were able to communicate some pretty sophisticated stuff to one another. They found that if you took a bunch of bees in a hive and you put a feeder full of sugar water, you could train bees to go and visit that sugar water feeder. And then if you filled a whole bunch of other feeders that you had spread across the sort of landscape, across the area that those bees were flying in, you could suddenly fill all of them up with sugar water, and you could look at bees that you had never seen at feeder F. So not the bees that you had trained to come here, but the brand new recruits. You could look at which of these feeders were visited by those new recruits, and what you found is that the vast majority of those bees were being directed in the same direction as the feeder. And so clearly those bees weren't being told, hey, get out here, look for some food. They were being told, come out here and fly in this direction. They did further studies where they put out other glass feeders full of sugar water, and they discovered that when you, again, train bees from the origin, from the hive back here, to fly to a feeder that is 750 meters away, and then you put out a whole bunch of additional feeders and fill them up and only look at the new recruits who are going to visit those feeders, you discover that most of the new recruits are going to the feeders that are closest to the original target feeder. Something in the dance was communicating to the other bees that they needed to fly off about this distance away and in that same direction. They observed that when these bees were dancing, they would occasionally make stops, and they basically dole out free samples of food to the other bees nearby. They would stand antenna to antenna, tongue to tongue, mouth to mouth to one another. And they thought perhaps in some way the taste or the smell of the food was also being communicated. So von Frisch and his students described two different bee dances. The first was called the round dance, and in it, these bees engage in some particular choreography, and they discovered that this dance was basically used when food was less than 50 meters away from the hive, relatively close. And it means, hey, there's food, it's nearby, it smells like this, go out there and find it. This was the only dance that they saw for a long time, because early on, von Frisch and his students didn't want to walk more than 50 meters away to set up their sugar water feeders. But over time, they were forced by various circumstances to put the feeders further away, and they started seeing a more sophisticated dance that we call the waggle dance. In this, when food is more than 50 meters away, the bees engage in that figure-8 run that I already showed you the video of. The waggle run is when this bee waggles her abdomen, flutters her wings, and she engages in a very particular kind of dance. She's dancing at a very particular angle relative to straight up and down, relative to standing vertically on that beeswax comb that she's dancing on. So what they determined was that the bees were communicating the direction to the food source based on that angle that the bee was dancing at. But what that means is that the bees were essentially needing to use some kind of a compass. They needed to have some sort of, true north that they could point other bees towards. And then the deviation from that, based on this angle, was supposed to be the deviation that the other bees would fly. And von Frisch and his students suggested that the bees were using this dance language and a solar compass, a compass that essentially uses the position of the sun as its north, in order to tell other bees where they needed to fly. So the essential idea is this, that if I'm a bee and I live in a hive down here, I know where the sun is relative to my position. And so I can figure out, hey, I found this wonderful source of flowers. I'm going to fly home, and when I get there, I'm going to do a dance inside on the surface of the honeycomb. And I'm going to dance so that the angle relative to me dancing straight up and down is going to be the same as the angle that a bee would need to fly relative to just flying towards the sun. And that's going to direct my sisters to go out and find that food source. And von Frisch and his students were nearly laughed out of academia. The idea that these bees were using symbolic communication, that they were dancing on angles based on the relative position of the sun, was absolutely insane to anyone who had ever thought about animal behavior, studied insects, or even studied honeybees and their foraging. It was considered a kind of German madness. However, continued research and a great desire by other scientists to prove him wrong actually only ever proved him right, because this is precisely how the system works. Not only that, by moving the feeders around to different locations, they found that the number of waggles per run, basically how long that bee wiggles before he turns to the left or turns to the right and starts over, that corresponds to how far away the food source is. So, about dancing for a second means it's a kilometer away. 2 seconds might be 2 kilometers away. The longer a bee dances, that communicates the quality of the food. I'm not going to spend my time.
David,
Yes.
do you want to take a break and get some water? It'll be fine.
I have it next to me. I'm recovering from a cold.
I understand.
This is just the world we have to live in. I apologize for it.
No worries at all. I just didn't know if you had water nearby.
No,
so that's
nothing will get it any better. So
okay.
Don't worry, I can't infect you through the microphone. But the key point here is that the longer those bees dance, the more they're saying, I found a food source and it's a good one. And they are dancing. The scout bee that dances is surrounded by a group of recruit bees, these potential recruits who are going to evaluate that dance, consider that dance, and then go off and, based on their interpretation of it, try to find the same food. This is just an illustration of that idea I mentioned, that the duration of that waggle run in seconds corresponds to the distance to the food source in meters. So, if I'm dancing for 1 second, that might mean that it's 700 meters away. If I'm dancing for 2 seconds, that might be 200 meters away. 3 seconds, 3,000 meters, something like that. So the basic principle here is that there's a relationship between the dancing and both the distance and the direction that a bee would need to fly to find the food. The better the food source is, the longer the dancer will dance to advertise that food source. And this is really the heart of my talk here. This truth, this phenomenon, gives us an opportunity for these bees to not just send bees out to collect resources, but actually to allocate their resources in an intelligent way, to send out their foraging force to make good decisions about where they should go and what they should do on a given day. And to illustrate that, we can just look at this sort of schematic of a diverse floral landscape, and we can imagine for a moment that all of these different plant species are blooming. All of these patches are available to the bees. And we're going to assign them sort of arbitrary, values of let's say sugar content in their nectar. So let's say these yellow flowers, they've got 2% sugar. The purple ones, they're 6%. And the pink ones, they're 9% sugar. So, the 9% is more valuable than the 6, is more valuable than the 2. And so we've got these bees living in that hive, and the scout bees, they're always searching for new patches. They're always advertising what they've found. So there's sort of this continuous low level of surveying and scouting going on that's reporting new information back into the hive. But the better the food source is, the more aggressively the scout is going to dance. And that means that the signal for better food sources is going to be louder, for want of a better word, inside the hive for the better ones than it is for the worse ones. What this means, what we observe as a result, is that these bees are essentially going to focus their attentions. Most of the recruits are going to be going to those highest value food patches until they are no longer as high value because the bees have consumed the resources. Then we would expect to see bees sent to the next highest value, maybe this 6% concentration, but the one that's closer than the other two is going to get the most attention until it's depleted. Then we would see more scouts going off to the further high-value food resources. And only when those are depleted would we expect to see bees sent off to exploit the lowest value food resources around them. It gives the bees an opportunity to make intelligent decisions about where and when to send their foragers. And this is what we mean when we talk about collective intelligence of a bee colony. The queen is not sitting in there telling bees where to go. There's no air traffic controllers who are waving the bees in or directing them on where they're supposed to go next. It's individual bees who are saying, I'm really impressed with the site that I've found, so I'm going to dance about it for a while. And other bees that see that dance, interpret it, go off, find the food, and if they are also impressed with the quality of it, they're going to amplify the signal by doing a little dancing of their own. It means that these very, very simple rules that the bees are following let the collective of the hive, of the colony, make very good decisions. And unfortunately, other bees, even social bee species like some bumblebees, aren't capable of doing the same thing. So, if you study bumblebees in a similar context, unfortunately, the only recruitment many bumblebees are capable of is that a bee will fixate on one flower type early in the morning, and if she gets a decent enough reward from it, she's going to explore and then come home, and she'll run around and rouse her sisters and say, hey, look, I smell like this flower. Go out and look for something that smells like me. And the consequence is, at best, those bees might get recruited, in this case, to the lowest value food resource in the area. So, with all of this laid out before you, are you as smart as a honeybee? Can you waggle dance? So remember, the way this system works is the angle relative to vertical communicates the angle at which you need to fly relative to the sun to get to the food source. So that's a little hard to understand if I just say it that way. And if you can't interpret this diagram, it might be helpful to just do a little exercise here. If I'm a bee and I leave my hive and I fly off towards a flower, and then I fly home, and I remember that as I was flying towards that flower, the sun was basically shining in my eyes. And as I fly home, the sun is behind me. Where am I going to dance? Well, remember, it's the deviation from vertical that tells me how far to deviate from the sun. So if I don't have to deviate from the sun, if I'm just flying towards it, that means I just dance straight up. I dance vertically. Well, what if the flower is actually opposite the sun relative to the position of the hive? Well, then I just dance 180 degrees in the opposite direction. I dance straight down. Where is this bee dancing? What is she telling her sisters to do? We can see that she's dancing basically to the left. There's a little bit of slop in the signal here. There's some variation, but in general, if those girls will get out of her way, she's trying to dance more or less due left. So she's saying, go out, find the sun, turn 90 degrees to the left of that, and fly in that direction. That's the signal that she's trying to give to these other bees that are attending to her. So von Frisch and his students demonstrated that honeybees were communicating the direction, the distance, the quality, and the taste and smell of these floral resources. And that means that they're engaging in what linguists call symbolic communication, which is something that we humans very haughtily thought only human beings were capable of. Some great apes can do it. Dolphins and parrots seem like they can't quite handle it, although there's some studies that have suggested they can. But honeybees absolutely can. They can talk about food in a symbolic way inside the hive and then interpret those signals when they go out and try to find resources. And the beauty of all of this work is that it has actually since been confirmed by very, very advanced scientific research. So all of the work that von Frisch and his students did with pens and paper and glass feeders full of sugar water have been replicated by gluing harmonic radar antennae onto bees and then having those bees fly out of their hive and be tracked on their way to the feeder. So what we're seeing here are new recruits, bees that have never been to that feeder before, and those lines that go from the hive to the feeder are the bees that are interpreting dance signals that they saw in the hive and then zooming off and flying in the correct direction to find that food. What's even more impressive is that in this study, they took some of the bees in the hive. They were crawling out of the hive after having just seen that dance signal. And some graduate students grabbed those bees, glued their harmonic radar antennas onto them, and then sprinted as far as they could across this field and released those bees at these different orange release points. And what you can see is that the bees were tracked flying in the correct direction. They were going where they were supposed to go based on the dance that they had observed, even though they had been grabbed and run across the field and released at a spot different from where they were expecting, different from where their hive was. So the dance language is communicating really exactly what we thought it was. Now, this is sort of an impressive story to tell. As I said, a lot of scientists were very skeptical of it, but you might very justifiably have questions. And so I'm going to try to anticipate a number of those questions for you here. First of all, how do bees see a dance in a hive that has no lights inside of it? This is all happening indoors. Well, when bees do these dances, their wing vibrations produce a sound, a vibration that other bees can detect. If you clip a bee's wings, she's not an effective dancer. And even more impressively, if you create a robo-bee, a machine-controlled, computer-controlled robotic bee that wiggles and dances according to these dance rules, if it has razor blade wings that are vibrating, then it is able to communicate where other bees should go to get food. But if you mute those razor blade wings and they don't vibrate, then the bees can't interpret it. So it seems like it's more a feeling and an acoustic thing than it is actually watching the dance. How do bees measure distance? Well, von Frisch thought that it was probably the calories that they burned flying home. They could sort of estimate how far they had flown. But research has actually told us that it's something different. It's the optic flow of the landscape. Basically, these bees are flying over the landscape and they're interpreting just how much information is zooming past their retinas as they fly. And they use that to gauge the distance that they've flown. You might ask, doesn't the sun move pretty much all day, every day? Well, yes, it does. And bees actually adjust their dances over time to correspond to the movement of the sun. And more importantly, they're also foraging in between their bouts of dancing. It's not that a bee goes and finds a flower patch and then sits there and dances for the next 4 or 5 hours. Instead, she's got to go back and make sure that the flower patch is still good. Maybe a farmer came by and mowed down all of those flowers between when she was there this morning and right now. She doesn't want to be advertising a crummy food patch, and so she's got to go and make sure that it's still good. And when she does that, she can correct her recollection of where the sun is and where the flower patch is and change the angle of her dance a little bit. How is it that bees can use the sun when it's way up in the sky, right? Well, bees aren't actually using the position of the sun. They're using what's called the azimuth, which is basically using the angle to the point on the horizon that is closest to where the sun is. And at basically any time, you can say, sunset or sunrise, obviously we know where the sun is on the horizon. When the sun is up in the sky, it's still closer to one part of the horizon than the other. And so the bees are able to interpret that, and that's what they're using to direct one another. Because of that, it means that if you take a bunch of bees and you move them to the equator and you bring them there at high noon, when the sun is basically directly above them, bees actually will just stop dancing for about 15 minutes. Or if they do dance, the dances are highly disorganized. This study really was another validation of von Frisch's study, is that if you take away that tiny fractional information about whether the sun is slightly more to the east or slightly more to the west, the bees lose the ability to navigate based on it. What happens when it's cloudy, right? How can we use the solar compass? Because the sun is not always shiny and visible. Well, an advantage that honeybees have, that all insects have, is that their eyes are better than ours, at least at seeing polarized light. Bees are able to see the polarization of light, which is something that humans often only understand if we become physicists or photographers, where polarization is very important. But what it means is that they are able to see these sort of concentric rings that you can see illustrated here around the sun, and they can interpret the position of the sun based on the quality of light that it's emitting. So bees are essentially navigating a landscape that looks like this. They're flying through this light, and every particle of light that they're able to perceive tells them where the sun is positioned in the sky. And that's how they're able to communicate and interpret the sun's position to use the dance language. And you might be skeptical of this idea that all bees all over the world are speaking this same dance language. And it's fair. It's in fact true that not all bees speak the same language, or if they do, maybe they speak it with a different accent. Different subspecies of honeybees. So they're all the same Western honeybee species, but they have these different races or subspecies. These different subspecies use different dance dialects. So these are studies of the duration of that dance and the distance to the food source. This is the same basic graph that I showed you before, showing you how they communicate distance. And you can see that the curvature of these lines are different for these three different honeybee subspecies. It shows us that they're all using the same basic principles, the same basic rules. But if I took this bee and I put her down into this hive, if they didn't immediately sting her to death as an intruder and they allowed her to dance, they might have a slightly difficult time understanding her accent. So that is the amazing waggle dance language of honeybees, but it's not just waggle dances that they use to communicate. There are other signals that these bees use, like this shaking signal. So this bee right here in the center, sort of the center top of the screen, is walking around and she's grabbing other bees and she's going to start shaking them. And that shaking, where she pumps her abdomen up and down, looks something like this. And it is a signal that musters new nectar foragers. It's a way for her to say, hey, get the lad out. It's time for everybody to be ready to go out and start collecting food just like I am. Remember that bees don't dance like nobody's watching. If they want to dance and advertise food sources to recruits, they need to have recruits. And so if there aren't any bees paying attention to their dance, these bees are going to run around and engage in this shaking signal. This is a graph that shows two different kinds of dances, shaking signals in black and waggle runs in white that were performed by this bee, this individual, exact, precise honeybee that was very carefully observed from about 9 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. And what we see is that in the morning, when she's basically the only bee who's up and at 'em, the majority or the entirety of her signaling is this shaking signal, trying to get other bees motivated to forage. It's only at about 10:15 a.m. that she does her first waggle dance. But as the morning wears on, as there are more and more bees looking around, sort of hungry for information about where to go forage, she shifts over until about noon, all of her dances become waggle dances instead. There's another dance called the tremble dance that you can observe. And I won't tell you which bee is engaging in the tremble dance, but if you're astute observers, you might be able to figure it out. It's a pretty aptly named dance behavior. And this bee, sort of in the center right of the screen, it looks like she's having quite a time with herself. This tremble dance puzzled beekeepers and bee researchers for a very long time. It was actually first reported by Carl von Frisch, the master of honeybee dance language. And so in 1923, when he was sort of right on the cusp of revealing all of these amazing things about bee dancing, he said, at times one sees a strange behavior of bees who have returned home from a feeder or other goal. It's as if they had suddenly acquired the disease St. Vitus dance, or a kind of palsy. That was 1923. In 1967, a man who was on the cusp of winning the Nobel Prize for his work decoding the honeybee dance language wrote, I think the tremble dance tells the other bees nothing. It is perhaps comparable to the condition that another scientist has described as a neurosis. So even this man who was almost laughed out of academia for suggesting that these dances communicated something thought this one didn't mean anything. It took 70 years from its first discovery for us to finally figure out what was going on. And the discoverer of that was who else but my doctoral advisor, Tom Thiele. And he discovered this purely accidentally. He set out to study waggle dancing behavior. What he specifically wanted to study in 1990 was if a forager who is coming home from a food resource we would normally be getting ready to waggle dance. If no other bee comes and empties her tank, essentially, it puts away the groceries that she's just brought home, takes all of that nectar and stores it somewhere else. If no food storage bee shows up to unload her, does she stop dancing? Does she say, hey, obviously no one cares about this food, so I'm not going to waste my time dancing? So what they did was they trained a bunch of bees in a glass-walled observation hive, just like the one that I've got behind me right here, to go out and forage at a feeder. They marked all of the foragers, and they also marked all of the food storer bees that were taking their food and putting it away. So that evening, they removed all of the food storage bees from the hive, and then the following day, they looked at what the foragers did. Well, with no food storage bees, those foragers went out, they loaded themselves up with food, they came home, and they immediately started tremble dancing. It was clear that this was a signal that they were sending that said, there is something wrong, someone needs to take this food away from me. This is just a graph that shows what a bee is likely to do based on how long it takes her to find someone to unload her food storage organ, to take that food and put it away. The search time in seconds is given at the bottom, and if it takes the bee less than about 20 seconds to have herself unloaded, then we expect to see waggle dancing. However, if it takes between 20 and maybe 60 seconds, the majority of those bees actually engage in no dancing at all. They just get themselves unloaded, then they go off. Clearly, nobody's that eager for instructions to find another food source, so they often don't dance. However, if it takes them more than 60 seconds to be unloaded, the vast majority of those bees are going to be tremble dancing. So you might ask yourself, are all of these bee dances all about food? And the answer is no. For that, we have to expand our journey into Carl von Frisch's lab. This is Carl von Frisch wearing lederhosen next to a Volkswagen, trying to look as Austrian as humanly possible. And the other gentleman in lederhosen is Martin Lindauer, one of his students. And so Lindauer and the rest of von Frisch's lab worked with him. They demonstrated all of these wonderful things about the dance language. But Lindauer was his own scientist, and he wanted to strike off on study his own thing. And what he was really interested in was a different honeybee behavior. This is a swarm of honeybees disgorging from a beehive that has decided that it is going to replicate itself by budding in two. The old queen and about half of the workers are going to pour out of this hive and cluster up in a tree somewhere, and then the remaining bees are going to stay behind with some baby queens, and the new queen will take over the existing hive, the old queen and the other bees will go and found a new hive, and that is how one colony becomes two. But this is what those swarms look like when they're up on a tree. And what's interesting is that those swarms emerge from the hive. They sit up in a tree in a cluster like this for a period of, often hours or even days. And then they all fly off in the same direction. They find a box or a hollow cavity in a wall or a hollow tree to move into, and they set up shop and they start building combs. So Lindauer was wondering how they did that. He wanted to figure out what internal debates were going on inside of that swarm. And so while he was looking at these swarms that he had set up, he noticed some waggle dancers on the surface of the swarm. And he thought, oh, that's interesting. I guess some of the bees here must be going off and getting a little bit of food while this grand debate is happening deeper in the core. But he noticed that those waggle dancers were dirty. They were filthy. So this is a story about dirty dancing. Lindauer noticed that these bees were covered in stuff. They were covered in black stuff and white stuff and red stuff, and he couldn't figure out what it was until he looked more closely, and he started looking around at where these bees were going. And he realized that he was actually a very lucky scientist because he was studying this behavior in downtown Munich in 1945. And so these swarms that he was setting out and asking to find a new nest location, they were sending out scouts. And those scout bees weren't looking for food and weren't coming home covered in yellow pollen. They were looking for nest sites. And so they were coming home covered in soot from bombed out chimneys, or brick dust or plaster dust from bombed out walls. They were going to these damaged buildings throughout Munich, and they were trying to find nest locations, and then they were dancing about the nest locations they had found. He realized that inside the swarm, nothing very interesting was going on. It was on the surface that these bees were using the exact same waggle dance language to debate amongst themselves about where they thought the swarm should go and live. So what he observed was that initially the bees performed their dance in many different directions, and this is the Munich Botanical Gardens where he was setting up his swarms, and then these dotted lines trace all of the different swarms that he chased down the street, yelling, to his neighbors and townsfolk, please leave the bees alone. They're part of a scientific experiment. They won't harm you, but I need to see where they go. But he observed that initially they were all dancing in many different directions, but before the swarm flew off, all of the dances pointed in one direction. Well, because his lab, Karl von Frisch's lab, had discovered how to interpret that dance language, he could suddenly eavesdrop on what they were saying, and he realized that the swarms always flew in the direction of the consensus dance site. And so he interpreted that as these bees basically reaching consensus via dance and then all flying off together to explore and move into their new home. That work led to a great deal of research on this same subject, again, by my doctoral advisor, Tom Seeley. And what he demonstrated more clearly than anyone else is that swarms not only choose their nest sites this way, they actually make good decisions about where they want to live. This is just one illustration of a trial where a swarm was given a choice between 5 different nest boxes. 4 of them were identical. They were relatively small. One of them was larger and therefore better. It had more space. It was going to give them more capacity for a better life. And so the scouts that they observed going out and visiting these sites would go, they'd dance a little bit, and then they'd leave. They'd go, they'd dance a little bit, and then they'd come back. But over time, the bees eventually discovered this higher quality, more valuable nest site, and very, very quickly increased the frequency of dancing that pointed in that direction until eventually this swarm took off and decided that they wanted to fly towards nest box number 5. The bees were making a collective decision that was intelligent based on these very simple rules that they were using. So Tom was able to do a number of experiments where he basically would set out 2 nest boxes next to one another or near one another, and he'd ask a multitude of swarms to choose between them. And based on that, he could say, all right, well, they prefer, a nest entrance size that is 75 square centimeters over 15 square centimeters, or vice versa. He could determine that they preferred a nest box that was larger or smaller, higher up in the air or down closer to the ground. And by taking all of these different factors and putting them together, he was able to figure out what the dream home is for a honeybee swarm. And maybe to no one's great surprise, it's exactly where they live in nature. It's a hollow tree cavity up in the air, protected from skunks and bears and things like that. More than 5 meters up, with a relatively small entrance facing south so that they could get early morning sun in northern climates, and with a relatively spacious cavity, something that could hold 30 to 50 liters of comb, bees, developing brood, and most importantly, honey to get them through the winter. We know that these bees are engaged in complicated decision-making. Each individual goes to the site herself, and she makes a private evaluation of it. She paces around, she walks and flies inside of the box, and she evaluates how big she thinks it is, how good she thinks it is, how dry, how safe. But then when she returns, she makes a public report on what she's found. And that public report is done through the waggle dance, which is interpreted by other bees who are observing her, who will then themselves fly off and make their own private evaluation. And so this is an illustration of just one 16-hour-long debate that a single swarm engaged in. It involved 149 nest site scouts, and they evaluated 11 different sites over the course of 3 days. It begins on the 20th of July, and in the first 2-hour period from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., what we can see is that the swarm, situated here at this point in the center of the graph, had discovered a number of different nest sites, A, B, C, D, E, and F. And these nest sites pointed off in different directions. They were different distances away. That's how long the arrow is. And the thickness of the arrow tells you how many bees are dancing about it. So early on in that first period, site A is getting some love. Site B and site D each have a couple of bees dancing in their direction. But sites C, E, and F, they only have 1 bee apiece pointing off in their directions. In the next 2-hour block, as we continue to observe these bees, we can see some stuff has changed. We found a new site, site G, which is of interest to a few of the bees, as well as site H. We've also seen that site F no longer has any fans, and site F will never be discussed again for the rest of this experience. Whoever found site F decided it was crummy. She didn't go back, and no one else went back there either. Over the course of the next day, we can see that by the end of it, sites B and G have become the favorites, but there are still plenty of other sites being discovered and danced about. The following day, from 7 a.m. until a rain shower began at about noon, the bees continue to dance, and they have a building interest in site G, although site B has a lot of adherents as well. The following day, from 9 a.m. until noon, all of the bees that danced are dancing in the direction of site G. 100% of the scouts are pointing themselves in that direction, and then the swarm takes off and they fly in the southwest, which is the direction that site G was. So we saw these bees over the course of this 3-day period develop this consensus view, discuss and debate and sort of democratically choose amongst themselves where they wanted to go, and then make a good decision about the best possible nest site for them to move into. This is a sophisticated version of this dance language because it is a very important single choice. Do we live in this hollow tree or that hollow wall or this bait hive hung up by a beekeeper? But it is the same principle that these bees are using to navigate their landscape and to find food and flowers in that landscape around them. So Lindauer's work showed that these bees were using the dance language for locating and finding the best possible nest locations. Carl von Frisch's work and other scientists' work who have followed after him have found that these bees are using the language to find the best possible use of their foraging force to go out and visit flowers. And all of this amazing, sophisticated behavior of these honeybees is described in much more detail in a book called Honeybee Democracy, again by my doctoral advisor, Tom Thiele. He doesn't pay me to talk so glowingly about him, but he deserves it, so I will. And so this is the collective intelligence of honeybees. They are a remarkable species. They have been able to spread around the world and adapt very effectively into a number of different landscapes because of their sophistication. But they are not the only sophisticated bee. And so I'm very excited about the lecture that is going to start 5 minutes from now, assuming I can wrap up in that much time. Which is going to be all about all of the other bees that aren't honeybees. But I do want to tackle just one point before I turn the reins over to Sam, who is a remarkable expert on this subject. I just want to tackle this question of whether we should be talking about honeybees, these bees I've been, praising this whole time, as an invasive species. And to do that, I think we should start with defining what an invasive species is. So the National Invasive Species Council and the Invasive Species Advisory Committee in 2006 adopted this definition, which I think is a strong one. It's an invasive species is a species that is non-native to the ecosystem under consideration, the ecosystem you're looking at, and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So by looking at this definition, we actually have two questions that we're asking ourselves. Are honeybees an invasive species? Well, are they an exotic species or a native species? That's question number one. And then number two, if they're exotic, are they invasive or are they not invasive? Are they not, from here, but they're not causing harm? So that first point we can answer pretty easily. Are they exotic or are they native? Western honeybees, Apis mellifera, the species that I've been talking about and that I keep here in New York, are exotic. They're non-native. They were introduced by European colonists from Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. That is the native range of that honeybee species, period. However, there's a little caveat, because we have fossil evidence from a fossil found in 2009 that there was a native honeybee species here in North America. It's been dated to about 16 to 12 million years ago. The species is called Apis nearctica, and if we look at it, we can see clear anatomical features that tells us that this probably was pretty darn similar to the honeybees that we've got. And so it could be asked, and maybe even argued, that on the evolutionary timescale of a lot of the plants that are native to the Americas, is it possible that honeybees aren't so much non-native as it is that they were here, weren't here, and now they're back? So that's a question to be asked from the perspective of the plants, from the honeybees, and from the non-honeybee species that we're going to be talking about in the next lecture. But if we look at this definition again, we can say surely honeybees are non-native to the ecosystem under consideration. But does their introduction cause, or is it likely to cause, economic or environmental harm? So we can look at scientific research and we can look at different studies to try to figure out how honeybees and native bees interact. Are honeybees causing a competitive problem for the native bees? Well, this study found that when you have both exotic honeybees and exotic bumblebees in a landscape, they become the most common visitors to the native plants, but they actually don't affect the rate at which those plants are pollinated, and they also don't affect the rate at which native bees visit those plants. The native bees were getting all that they needed. It's just that these exotic bees were also there, and they're in plenitude. Well, then that would make me say maybe they aren't invasive. This study that looked specifically at the common camas, a particular flower, they said that they found compelling evidence that honeybee introductions indirectly decrease pollination by reducing the availability of nectar and pollen for native bees and competitively excluding visits by those native bees. And that honeybees were basically piss-poor pollinators of this flower. And so as far as that flower was concerned, the honeybees were doing them no good and a great deal of harm. Well, in that ecosystem for that flower, I would say maybe they are invasive. This is another study that looked at the visits by honeybees and non-honeybees to various wild flowers around the world. And if we just zoom in on North America, we can see that the brown, showing the percentage of the visits that are done by honeybees, Apis mellifera, is relatively small in all of these different contexts that they studied. Maybe this is a place to look closely at. But the rest of these areas, it would seem that there are a lot of other insects that are perfectly able to go and visit a lot of these flowers, even if the honeybees aren't present. And so perhaps that suggests that they aren't competitively excluding all of the bees that we might otherwise want to preserve. And then other studies suggest that the presence of honeybees are actually harmful to native pollinators and can even be harmful to the set of certain fruits like strawberries. So the research is very much open. And the question that we have before us is, in the particular context that we're looking at, the particular plants, the particular landscapes, are honeybees neutral, even helpful, or harmful? And I will end with this last slide on this point, which is we need to be careful about the difference between whether something is invasive versus whether its presence is just exceeding the carrying capacity of the ecosystem. What I mean by that is, if I've got 3 fish in a fishbowl and this one's invasive and the other 2 are native, as long as they're all eating their fish food, sharing happily and not reproducing at a crazy rate, nobody's got any real problem. If I take all of the fish in the world and I put them into that same fishbowl, even if they're all native, they're going to exceed the carrying capacity and there's going to be trouble. And a lot of the research that shows that honeybees negatively impact native bees seems like it could be that the honeybees are basically just overwhelming the local landscape because there are simply too many of them being brought in, and that a low density of honeybees probably isn't going to do the same harm as a massive bee farm moving in and setting up shop. So bees as livestock are different than bees as animals out in the landscape, and it's important to make distinctions between those as we're trying to grapple with whether these non-native bees are invasive or simply a non-native but naturalized introduction to the landscape. With that, I will conclude, ignore all of these words, which we haven't had time to look at, and the passenger pigeons and all of that. And I will thank you very much for your attention.
Yes.
I'm happy to stay on and answer questions in the Q&A while Sam gets started with his talk.
I appreciate that, David. And I honestly, I didn't realize how much I didn't know about honeybees. So I'm grateful for your talk. I have one question that's in the chat that I would like to just ask you for the benefit of everyone watching.
Sure.
Someone recently read that individual honeybees imprint on the first species of flower that they nectar at when they emerge. And she wondered if that is the only species they will ever visit. She read that. No.
So that's a phenomenon called floral fidelity. And most bees, many bees do that, but it is typically going to be something that they'll engage in for the first, the first flower that a bee visits in the day might be the flower that she fixates on for the rest of the day, maybe even for a week. But for the most part, these bees are going to be foraging for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and the flowers might only be blooming for 1 week at a time. So she wouldn't be very productive if she was only looking for that one species of flower. So it's a phenomenon, but it's not going to completely drive which flowers she visits. They'll go where the best food is.
Sounds good. Thank you, David.
Thank you. And I won't take any more of Sam's time.
And welcome, Sam. He cut into that native bee time, didn't he? Well, yeah. Sam, it's my pleasure to introduce Sam Drogi. He's going to be presenting today, Native Bees Are Picky, What You Plant Matters. So Sam, with that, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Renee. And let me share my screen. But
You
while
bet.
I'm doing that, oh, can you hear me? Am I
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I can hear you.
all right? I'll just mention, because David brought it up, that I have been a contra dancer for 3, 4 decades. So
Oh,
it was just so fun to see that there. But he is
that's
from New England.
great.
Of course, everyone up there contra dances. Okay. Let's see. I think I'm sharing, and I
Excellent.
think
Oh,
I
you're
can.
sharing me.
Oh, but can you see my talk now?
Yeah, got to hit play though. But yeah, I can see your
Okay.
PowerPoint.
All
Yeah.
right. I'm going to bring it up full screen, and here we go. And also thanks to Dave, I do not have to cover much of anything about honeybees now. Security alert from the government. Okay. All right. So we'll show this slide here at the end. There's contact information. All the pictures here are public domain. You can do whatever you want with them. We put no restrictions. People sell them. We have a catalog of over 5,000, blow up the size of a billboard. Please use them however you want.
Great.
Many of them are flowers too. Okay, I want to put some context in here first. So we're basically Eastern North American people, and a lot of times, we're in a very used environment largely. Like everything has been built on, cut down, plowed, all many patterns. But so we tend to, I think, in a way, look outside, say like, oh, look at the Amazon, the Serengeti, all these other exotic places that National Geographic feeds up, the high Arctic, and say, if only we had that kind of complexity. One of my points is we do. So our landscape is equally as evolved, equally as complex. The relationships, as you'll see, between bees, plants, and all these other creatures are the exact same number of years has been cooking here in the East as it has in the Amazon. So I think we want to add a little appreciation out there for our the neighborhood park and things like that, because there's a lot going on there. The other thing is I want to point out is like what is special? What is special here? And there's a bunch of small scale special things. We could talk about them forever, and including right in Ohio. But what I want to point out is that the big special thing is deciduous woods. Okay, that's our big endemic ecosystem in a way. If we go way down south, we can look at Florida and talk about that too. But that's the center of our attention is up here. And so when we talk about pollinators, we tend to be looking towards the fields and prairies, and we're going to plant a pollinator meadow and things like that. But I just want you to keep in mind that if all the humans in this landscape disappeared, this would be woods. And if you go further to the south, you start getting some natural lightning strikes. And so you would have open areas. You go further to the west, and the same thing occurs. You have prairie there, you have southern prairie essentially. But once you get into the Appalachians for sure, and then into the Piedmont areas, and then when you're up in New England and Ohio, the basically every square inch of that would be forest, with the exception of wetlands and barrier islands. And we say, oh, well, Ohio in particular, all those neat little places of prairie, well, those were created mostly by indigenous cultures. So we also have this weird thing. So for the last 15,000 years, there's been man on this landscape, and the tools that were present for the indigenous folks were not bulldozers and iron. I always tell people, try to cut down a tree with a stone axe. It's just not very efficient. But they had fire and they used it all the time. So a lot of our prairie remnants and things like that we look at, barrens and sand plains and all these kinds of areas that maintain an open aspect, are filled with plants that are from the prairie and are from the south that have moved in because of this multi-century uh, uh, world of burns all the time. So they were sophisticated. So they were burning for many different reasons. We don't have time to get into it. So the reality is we have no natural landscape in a way. I want you to think about the landscape as maybe a little more forested, and think about trees, shrubs, and understory and vernal plants more than anything else. Right now, you're your landscape of your house is basically partially forested landscape, right? Because you have probably one red maple in the middle of that quarter-acre lot behind your house. So we can think about recreating that, not how do I get these open prairie things into my landscape. You can do both, but don't forget the tree thing. So I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I think it's important for us to have a why are we going to do certain things part of the lecture. So I talked about a lot of these things. We are complex. We have a wonderfully beautiful and partially corrupt ecosystem going on, but you don't have to go far. Most stream valleys, most even ditches and woodlots have a lot of that biodiversity lingering around, and we have many protected areas to augment that. And let's see, we talked about indigenous fires, and we talked about all this, so we'll move on. Okay, so now, though, many of us, and our house can be thought of the same way, live in a city. So very anthropogenic types of habitats. So we have so modified it to meet our cultural needs, right? So we have a set of cultural ideals for what places like cities should look like, and it's not filled with native plants of the kind that were there at one point. And when we look closer, it's pretty obvious when we talk about, say, insect apocalypse or changes. It's pretty obvious, like a house provides no habitat for bees, a driveway doesn't, your deck is a zero, and on. Lawns, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but lawns can be completely negative or they can be slightly positive, but they're not the same kind of habitat that they replace. And we have non-native ornamentals, which can attract bees, but the difference is they probably don't support bees. So don't support the kinds of bees that we're interested in supporting, the ones of conservation concern, rather than just like more bees. So you can think of non-native plants in general and lawns and some of these things as like bird feeders, right? So a bird feeder attracts tons of birds, maybe bees too, birds. And what's the situation there, right? It's crows, it's sparrows, it's all those species coming to those bird feeders. Wonderful to look at and to view, not a problem. None of those are rare. Bird feeders help none of those survive, doesn't help the species concept. Everything in terms of conservation of birds is outside of the feeder world. So many of our cities are producing similar kinds of things. When we look at all plants and animals within a city, the biodiversity goes way down. You have crow and sparrow type communities in each of the native plant, the different kinds of insects, and so forth. But the interesting thing is, while you're not bringing back many of those birds, you're certainly not bringing back panthers and wolves into those environments, you can bring back these bees. And we're going to really focus on that. Bees are small. They are very good at dispersing, and they will settle in your yard if you provide them the correct kinds of plants. And this is another key thing. Bees are super picky. Okay. Each bee species has a short list, sometimes one species, of the plants it finds acceptable to gather pollen from. Nectar lists are longer, but that's not critical. Pollen is always a limiting thing. And each plant, by the way, has a short list of bees that it's working with. And you create, as you'll see, as you know, really, all kinds of lovely flowers. So here's my nominal honeybee shot. Some of you smart people, David, is going like, that's a drone. And it is. So this is the male, which is rare in the environment in terms of seeing this. But my main point here is waggle dances. There are no waggle dances going on in the native bee world. And in fact, while every single person in the United States knows what a honeybee is, they then, though, have this problem. They know very little about the native bees. This is a good thing about my talk, right? And other talks like this, is you're learning new things. But the Rolodex of bee information is the Rolodex of honeybee information. And honeybees are radical, right? They are radically different from almost all other bees around the world in how they do things. That's why we love them and we use them and they produce honey. Not to go into a lot of detail, but the way to think about it is anything you know about honeybees or think you might know about honeybees, but you're not sure, that doesn't work in the native bee world. So you might have to eliminate a whole bunch of David's talk in your mind. But honeybees, he only talked about a small bit of the magicalness of this species. But the thing is that almost none of that is a working model for our native species. Do we have time to talk about this in detail? We do not. So we're moving on to some of the things. And I'm going to be talking not so much about the bees. I'm going to be mediating this through flowers and through gardening and through things that grow in your area. And the messaging will be about what can you do to plant more of those kinds of flowers. And if you want to learn the details, contact me, right? Email me, I'll send you information, but you're not going to learn it here. It's just too complicated. Maybe you will. You'll learn cocktail tips. How about that? Okay, so we have to talk about stings. Basically, no, it's not a stinging issue. Bees don't defend flowers. Honeybees don't defend flowers either. They defend their hive, and the vast majority of the several thousand species of bees in the United States don't defend even their nests because they're single moms. Again, not enough time for those details. I'll give you an FYI, no one's allergic to any of the native species venom. It's another magic trick that the honeybees have, which is that they can kill you. So all kinds of good things there. So you don't worry about, oh, I'm going to put in a pollinator garden and then someone's little darling is going to go down. They're not. It's not an issue. So very broad background, 4,000 species of bees in North America, roughly. We're still figuring out what the names are for a bunch of them. It's complicated. It's been ignored. The taxonomy is constantly in need of updating. Oh, my computer says, keep going. I'll give you an example. About 300 species in my county where I live and work. That is not a surprise, really, because I do most of my studies there. But everyone on this conference or on this call, whatever it is called, you have access to at least 100 species of bees that could be in your yard. Now, in most cases, they're not. And the reason is that you haven't given them what they want. They're looking for very specific kinds of plants, and your landscape lacks them. And if you have a lawn, they are definitely passing right over that. So, but this is the magic here, which is you plant it, they will come. So now I'm just going to go through a series of flower pictures and talk very generally about what's going on so that you realize that the diversity of flowers and plants associated with them is really part of this dance between the native bees and the flowers. A few other insect species are involved, but mostly it's bees. And how complex that is. Spurge, this is a thing that you pull out of your mulch bed or on the cracks in the sidewalk. Some are native, some are not native, but it's small, but they have flowers. Very, very small bees go to that. And you probably have never even bothered to see them, but it's true. They don't sting you, they don't attack you. They're minute, and they are little black dots on the landscape. And the majority of bees in a landscape are little tiny bees. The majority are the size of a grain of rice or smaller. So, which is why no one knows anything about them, because you have to use a microscope to identify them. Here are hawkweeds. So this class, which also includes the non-native chicory, has a set of bees that are only going to the small hawkweed kinds of things. And big bees like bumblebees and many of the other species completely ignore this group. But again, it has an MO to get pollinated, and it has a group, a clade of bees that are working with it. In fact, they are much more common than the bumblebees and the honeybees in many ways. An example of just one of many spring, early summer plants. And here I just want you to look at this architecture. Look at all those stamens and pistils and that arrangement. Like, why is that? And the answer is it's working and attracting and has something set up with a certain set of bees, and that works for them. Thank you, plant and evolution, for giving us for supporting the floral industry. Blueberry, set of specialist bees only go to blueberry. That vase shape, those bees often, not entirely, have a very long head, so they can stick it way down there and grab the nectar at the bottom, and the stamens are all glued together in a tube, a pollen tube, and you have to shake the tube by vibrating in a certain level, which many species don't know to do. That's only the specialists know how to do that. And they vibrate it and the pollen falls out. You don't vibrate it, you don't get any pollen, because they want just their special friends to pollinate them. Hollies, just another whole system. We'll talk about these. These are party plants. They're dioecious, so some are males, some are females. They can have ungodly numbers of bees coming to them, and they're attracting as many and as diverse a set as possible because they're not excluding them. They're very open flowers. So this includes many of the shrubby species, those Ilex verticillata and nuda. You have a long list of things that you can add to a shrub layer and not have a giant holly, which of course takes a million years to get to, and still be doing good things. Again, I'm just giving you just some very quick examples of different floral shapes. Here's golden Alexander's. You would say, oh, that's a big flower, but the reality is it's a big group of very small flowers. And the way it's set up is most of the bees that are pollinating that are very small bees, not bumblebees aren't going in there. Also, nicely, it's a nice bedding plant early in the spring, one of the few early spring open-ish country flowers that blooms and has a nice yellow bloom. It's hard to find native plants that bloom in a meadow-like environment. Golden Alexander's, one of them, several species to choose from. Well, here's a friend of the bees that is not the friend to most gardeners. I actually have little beds of horse nettle, but who would do that, right? Well, if you knew how important they were to bumblebees and that they have other things coming in, you might. They just don't make that list of, you're not going to find them in a floral shop. And you can see right there the tubular nature of the stamens and the little hole that pours out like a salt shaker. Pollen, once bumblebees love this one, shake it at a certain vibration. So some of our weeds are native, and some of those native weeds, whether we like them or not, I will glancingly say poison ivy has flowers and bees go to it, and then not mention it ever again in this talk. But here's a lovely one. If you're in the slight south, mid-Atlantic area has these just barely. Passion flower, so this is Passiflora lutea, not the incarnata, which is big maypops. And take a look at the architecture, right? What's going on there? There's the stamens in a trellis or an umbrella down, and then there's pools of nectar in the lower part. Yeah, what's going on is bees come in. These are very small flowers, by the way, not like the passion flower. And a very small specialist bee comes in, and it dabs the back of the bee with pollen. And why does it do that? It does that because the bee can't really reach back there and get rid of that pollen and move it in and clump it with nectar into an unavailable bollocks of pollen on their legs. So bumblebees and honeybees too, that big ball of pollen, that ain't doing nothing for pollination because it's not available. It's covered with honey, or not honey, nectar. So many levels going on. So it's the loose pollen on the backs and the sides of bees, including bumblebees and carpenter bees and honeybees, that's doing the action. So that's what the plant's MO is. So that's its strategy. Here we have a composite, midsummer, certain bees are going to this. They are not supporting the same group of bees, the bees that go to composites late in the fall. Completely different set of bees. So the fleabanes, June, July into August, smaller, different set of bees are exploiting that very different looking flower at a different time of year. Many of these bee species are out for only a brief period of time when their flower system is blooming, and then the rest of the year they're underground as developing young. the flight season for a bee is very short. 5 weeks. A female, after 5 weeks, her wings are shredded or she's been eaten, and that's basically it. So that's the last stage. And for example, a honeybee worker is going to be sent outside to gather pollen until it's dead. Sad story, but that's how it works. And so vervain. So here's swamp vervain or blue vervain, and you can see here's a plant with a nice big spire, but the flowers are small. Many flowers have the same strategy. They bloom sequentially, so there's a long period of time that this bloom is available for pollen and nectar provisions by very small bees, again, because each of those individual flowers is quite small. Opposite, turtlehead, big, queen bumblebees are the target. They have to muscle in there because the private parts are hidden. So again, all these plants, all these different shapes, all kinds of different strategies. Jewelweed, splitting the difference between hummingbirds and bumblebees, and sometimes carpenter bees, which tend to just bite the bottom and suck the nectar out. But it's got the orangish color that is partially attractive to hummingbirds and several other species, and there's tons of nectar in the bottom of that. Again, very different shape. Milkweeds all pretty much have the same MO, right? Which is tons of nectar. In fact, I can't remember the exact figure, but there is a calculation like 30% of the entire milkweed energy budget, like everything that it's doing, is nectar. Nectar, the only reason to have nectar is it doesn't do the plant directly any good. It's to attract pollinators. So it's very important for that. And inside that 5-chambered flower are sacs of pollinia that literally physically clip onto the extremities of bees and large butterflies. And you'll see them. They're fluorescent orange, at least the ones on the common milkweed. Others, I think, are different colors. And all kinds of stories about honeybees in particular are sort of just a little too small sometimes, and they get trapped in the flower. And you'll see them dangling and wondering, what's going on? Well, milkweed has clipped on, but they haven't been able to pull out the pollinia. Buttonbush, wetland plant. Many of the wetland plants have flowers that are highly attractive to bees, even if the bees can't nest right there. They have wings. They just fly to the nearest appropriate landscape that has dry land that they make their nests in, or sometimes in the plant itself, broken ends and things. Look at it though. So stamens sticking way out. What the heck's going on there? The bees on there are very small. They're exploiting the nectar-bearing parts on that, and so are a bunch of butterflies, skippers, hair streaks, and everything else. And those sticky outy stamens, they're butterfly dabbers, right? So butterfly lands, long legs, long tongue. Hey, not really touching any of the pollen parts unless the plant pushes it up to them. In that case, it does. There's several other examples of that too. Redbud, legume. This is a classic legume floral pattern. And in a lot of these legumes, beans, whatever you want to look at, you have to have a fairly big bee that can, again, muscle in. Where are the stamens and the pistils on this thing? Well, they're inside. To get in, you have to basically be strong. And a osmia or a carpenter bee or honeybees can do it too. And then all kinds of other things are going on inside there that limit the kinds of bees physically that can come in and grab these very expensive things that the plant's doing. Nectar is expensive. Pollen coated with fats, lipids, and proteins, also really expensive, right? So you don't want just any old bug coming in and having a free lunch if it's not going to do any pollination. So there's a little war going on, and it's continued, and we get the benefit of getting to look at and gaze at all this beautiful signaling the plants are doing to attract pollinators, because color is the signal. Groundsel tree, odd one, right? It's actually a groundsel bush. Becker's hemifolia. It's actually a composite. And you can kind of see that there. But what a kind of strange looking blooms. Like, is that the seeds or is that the actual bloom? They look about the same. And I think it's dioecious too at the same time. Could be wrong about that. And but we don't think of it as a pollen producing plant because it's not pretty, have pretty flowers. But tons of bees go to this one too, very late in the year in areas filled with salt, which now include many highway overpass clovers where all the salt drains off. This basically salt marsh, edge of salt marsh bush now inhabits, like in Maryland, I go home and there are all the ground salt trees. So you can also, they're pretty tough. You can plant them in your yard. A little ratty maybe for the, garden club set, but it's a solid tree, bush. Spring Beauty, part of a large group of vernal, floor-hugging forest plants that come out before or as the plants above them, the canopy is starting to expand. They've been putting out their leaves for quite a while. There's this huge flush of these kinds of flowers in certain sweeter soiled kinds of places or bottomlands. And Spring Beauty has its own bee that only goes to it, covered with pink pollen as it goes along. And there are many, many stories of the bees that are using the uvularias, the Solomon seal, the trilliums, the erythronia in these bottomlands and these other places. And we need to think about pushing these flowers back in, which don't really spread well, into recovering forests. An old soybean field has trees right away, but getting those kinds of plants to move back in takes a long time. Corey Dallas, I don't even know what's going on here. Like that, what a crazy looking flower. Who pollinates that? I'm not sure. There's probably some literature that I'm just not aware of. A little bit. So you can think about this now when you look at flowers and the flowers that you're going to see here in the rest of the talk, that architecture has meaning. So now what I want to do is frame how you can help bees and native bees. And by the way, a lot of these will attract honeybees too. So it's not a either or kind of situation. It's an and. So, I'll just I'm talking about all these stories, all these details, and it's like overwhelming, isn't it? Like 4,000 species with all these things that you don't know anything about. How do I make the right selection? So the basic point in the next few slides is don't worry about it, right? Don't, overthink it. Basically, I'm giving you some basics. And if you later find something out about, I really want to have, Lysomachia for the Macropus bees, the oil collecting bees, do it. But right now, in the basic, like I need to do something, which you do, then because your yard has corrupted nature in a way. I better not go too far down that philosophical pathway before I annoy people. But basically, you're giving back when you're planting native plants. So let's look at this. So first off, if it's a native plant and has big colorful flowers, it's a pollinator plant. You might not know the details, so just plant it. So there's easy enough to do that one. Diversity of native plants in your yard equals a diversity of native bees for the reasons we've been mentioning, because so many of these bee species are really picky, really specialized. So you spread out that smorgasbord and you're going to attract more kinds of bees when you have more kinds of plants. So there's another strategy that doesn't require looking up a bunch of stuff about the bees, but you can. We'll show you a link in a second. Different colors. Why are flowers different colors? They are signals, and they signal to different pollinator groups. The Didyma, bergamot there at the bottom, that's saying, hey, hummingbirds, come and get it. So in the east, we have one hummingbird, kind of pathetic compared to the west, and we have, though, a few plants that are specializing on hummingbirds. A lot of them, though, kind of hedge their bets, and so sometimes you'll see other species of bees, small bees, working that same system. Anyway, I better not get into a lot of detail. But each of these colors attracts, and we've done lots of studies of this, these colors attract different sets of bees just by the color alone. And if you see that upper right one, that brown maroon color, that's a fly beetle flower, right? Bees don't really see browns, blacks, greens, and reds even as a color that attracts their attention. We do that way, color preference studies of all kinds of different kinds, because we're trying to trap bees using just color alone, and the traps that are those colors get nothing. Pink, blue, purple, pink, blue, yellow, white, end of the spectrum. That's where the action is. So now, and who doesn't want a bunch of different colors in their garden? So different flower shapes, as we've just been alluding to in that first part of the talk, means different kinds of bees. So you don't want just all open flowers. You want a variety of different kinds with different sorts of shapes going on. Basically, the more crazy the shape, the more specialized probably that flower is. Many choices there. And having bloom across different seasons, also important. I mentioned briefly that many bees are out for only a short period of time. So if you have a spring bee, but all your flowers are in the fall, you are not going to have that bee. So, and again, as say a gardener or a person who wants to bring nature back into your yard, why go forest bathing, right? Everyone's doing that when you could bathe in your own forest and your own house by having native plants all around. I never could get that, right? Go forest bathing and then come back to a toxic lawn with 4 conifers and then go into your house filled with, well, I won't go there. So look at this and just think, when you're making your plans, I want bloom throughout the summer, overlapping kinds, adding in all those different sizes and shapes, and good things will happen. So now some groups. Vines, don't underestimate vines. Many of these have specialist bees. Here we see groundnut at the top, a legume. We see the 2 passion flowers, native to the east in the bottom. We see bignonia, a southern species, but it can creep up into the mid-Atlantic. And then Ipomaea pandurata, what a lovely plant. It basically can be as good as any morning glory, but that particular flower or that particular species compared to other, like our classic blue ones and things, it has a set of bees that only go to it. And you'll see big bumblebees. You'll see maybe some of these Cimolobus species that come in early in the morning, and a variety of other species as they unfurl at dawn while you're outside watching dawn, drinking your coffee, and writing, which is what I do in the mornings. Sure, no one else gets up that early. But shrubs, okay. When we look at patterns of specialization, and therefore the patterns within specialization are going to equate to often conservation importance, meaning that they're uncommon because they're so specialized. Shrubs and perennials are where the action is in terms of these specialization components. So many of these shrubs, you have many options. We talked about some of these, but just to point out, viburnums tend to be more of a generalist bee species group. That middle one is Lyonia, Ligostrona. I can't remember. It's steeple. I shouldn't even say maleberry, maybe, but it looks very similar to Pyrrhus. You can treat it the same way as a foundation shrub, but it has a set of incredibly uncommon now bees with crazy life histories and often crazy, morphological shapes to them. I think the one on the right is probably Aronia, and it's more of a free-for-all species, but produces fruit. I should also mention as an aside, I'll show this with trees too. If you have a tree or a bush or vine or anything that's producing fruit that you eat, it has to be a good pollinator plant, right? Because if it doesn't attract pollinators, no fruit. So unlike a lot of commercial varieties of flowers where you get into varietals and cultivars, the pollen and nectar always stays in a fruit tree or a shrub or a blueberry bush, all those kinds of things that are being used as the edible landscape because they have to. Elsewhere, in a commercial sense, a lot of the plants that are highly bred, it's empty. There's no pollen and nectar left because the plant breeder doesn't care about pollen and nectar, but the plant has to produce something, lower stature, thicker bloom, longer bloom, bigger number of petals and changing sepals to petals. And it just robs the pollen and nectar for that, because that's why no one's asking for it. Trees, again, we're getting into the core of some of the specialness of the Eastern United States. So deciduous trees and I think conifers of different kind, like ilex, but not, of course, you don't maybe not know this, but all the pines and the spruces and the hemlocks and the firs, those are wind pollinated. And the trees you're seeing here, many of which, again, have been developed into edible or are partially edible, black cherry, the crabs. We have native crabs. You can even eat red bud that's up there, and the hollies, which you've talked about. But there's many others. Those are bloom. But think about it. Like, look at that middle picture of, let's call it an apple crab kind of thing. And it's the amount of pollen and nectar in that picture is unfreaking believable, particularly when you compare it to like a pollinator garden, which is 2-dimensional. So you have this 3-dimensional, long-term, unbelievable amounts of pollen and nectar over short periods of time usually. And so it's supporting huge numbers of bees. So if you're thinking, I need a tree in my front yard or along the hill strip next to the road, think putting in ornamentals that still are native. Well, you don't even have to, we're going to bend the rules there. So you don't necessarily have to do the native ones, but that have not been hybridized or old, created like, double bloom of cherry. That's a nothing plant for a pollinator. So lots of options here. So here's some general rules. Like each of those slides I could talk for 3 hours about. And so I have to really like pace myself, or the people running this talk will be mad at me. But okay, some very general rules to think about. Plant more blooming trees and shrubs, and do that into woodland edges. So many of our homes and our neighborhoods and our communities were basically carved out of forests, right? Whether we like it or not, our driveway through the trees to the place that we dropped a house. But if you think about forests, so the sub-canopy trees and the shrubs in there mostly are underneath closed canopy. They are just hunkered down, right? They are not producing much pollen and nectar or flowers or anything because they're waiting for some kind of opening because they're starved for sunlight. But at the edges, that's not as much the case. So think about, okay, I had to make this cut through the woods. Now plant it, right? So we don't think of that as a place to plant, but that edge, no matter where that edge is in that forest, that's where you want to plunk a lot of these forest-ish kinds of, and you have many to choose from, shrubs and trees. And then from that point on, and a general rule in all your native landscaping things, get rid of the invasive, which also love that area, right? And then control deer if you have the opportunity to control deer. I'll just put it in a side that sometimes you can't actually get rid of them, but use some of the anti-deer sprays, I'll call them. They have a different name. They're deer repellents. Some of them are really effective. Spring vernals, that's what you do when you have woods. You largely have to start thinking about, how do I bring them in, because if you're lucky, you have them, you're just controlling some of the invasives, and that encourages them to come back. But a lot of woods are new and were a farm field before. So think about installing some of these back in. If you're on the acid side of the forest spectrum, then you're all about ericaceous shrubs. You don't really have that vernal, floral, forb-based understory, but you do have the opportunity to have tons of blueberry, huckleberry, lionia, and leatherleaf, and all kinds of stuff. Big opportunity. Also, full of all kinds of bee specialization right there at that forest edge, too. If you have sandy soil, we don't have time to talk about, but many bees are key in on sand for nesting, and also some of the sand-loving plants. So think about that, and you have to weigh a lot of things, but creating that as a mini prairie, an open area, and not trying to grow a ton of grass or whatever on there. Open sand is a rare commodity and is a reflection of a lot of the burn sites and the sites that were maintained by the indigenous tribal folks a long time ago that were full of rare plants and rare bees. So open sand, scattered, sand-loving plants, something to shoot for if that's your base soil. In a general way, I always promote big yellow composites. Why? Because they get mowed all the time. So we're losing a lot of that component out of our landscape because inevitably the maintenance departments and the roadside folks are mowing the verges a couple times a year. I talk to them and say, like, hey, we only mow it twice, and yeah, a few things struggle through. Thank you, Daisy Fleabane. And sometimes we get black-eyed Susans can make it through a mowing, but most of them get whacked back too much, and it grows cool season grasses, and we are just losing these big yellow composites out of our landscape. So think about, how do I introduce those back in? A very general rule is, if you're mowing, do it once a year in the winter. And if you don't know what to do with that piece of property, mow it in the winter one time. Don't worry about planting. Things will happen that are going to be on the positive end of the landscape. And then you have lots of opportunities to do more. Additionally, when you look at your property, your yard, whatever, are you really using all that lawn, right? So the lawn along the edges, no one uses edges. You have the house, and you have a series of use zones out from there, but no one's like, hey, let's go to the edge of the property and hang out. So you're still mowing that, but that's the first place to look at planting back, feathering the edge, bringing nature back in through those spots. Okay, I'm talking too much. So we're going to keep going. Most bees nest in the ground. Leave some areas that are kind of open if those things exist, because that's attractive to those bees. Some bees nest in holes. You can put up these kind of mason bee nests, but just give your grandchild a drill, a cordless drill, and say, drill any piece of dead wood, including the fence, the telephone poles, the neighbor's fence, and also like your porch supports. No one notices, but the bees do, and it's a great place for them, and the kids will love you. So bees now, we talked about very picky eaters, right? So some of the surprising things that have specialist bees that only go to them are listed here. Again, each has a story, no time to talk about them, but we have compiled this. Thank you, Jared Fowler, for putting these lists together for East, Central, and Western states. And you can look it up using this link. If someone could put that into the chat, that would be good. But you could look up his name, 2 R's. And you'll see on the left the bees, which everyone's going to ignore because they're all scientific names that no one knows. But on the right, you'll see that a lot of these things are specializing on families like Asteraceae and in particular Helianthus. So sunflowers. So planting sunflowers is going to bring in a bunch of really cool bees, whether you know it or not. And these are the specialists. These are the ones most likely to be in trouble. Okay. Time for a little lawn shaming. This particular vision of a lawn, it has nothing, right? This is a chemically produced environment that at one point, decades to hundreds of years ago, was a lovely, natural, supporting of all kinds of biodiversity thing. And what in the world happened to humanity that they then took all that complexity and that beauty and made it into this, right? So when you're thinking about lawn, you have to, first of all, it would be good to get rid of all the men in your life, right? Because this is a man-made problem. And they're the ones that are competing with the other men in the neighborhood as a, like, look at me. And then neighbors are pointing out like, oh, you got a brown spot over there. And they're like, oh my God. So, I would just say that in general, what you want to do is start at the edges and bring it in. You can create and craft formal beds. That's fine. But the more naturalized the environment, the better. And you're really now repatriating a lot of this landscape for all of the troubles that were caused by man-made introductions of artificial environments, including things that you can't do anything about, like a house. So here is where you really get into giving back within your landscape, and it can be quite beautiful too. Additionally, I'll say a huge immediate successful way to support pollinators is to just stop mowing. Not so much in these, because it's going to take years for anything to even move into there. But think about these areas where you have, let's say, a larger property, edge of the woods, right? Or you're working with municipalities, edge of the parking lot where the baseball diamond is. No one's using those edges. Have the facilities people, which are often not included in these kinds of discussions, say, hey, if you could just not mow one mower deck out except once in the winter, then you provide immediately tons of supportive vegetation without having to do any complicated planting or overthinking it in any way. So not mowing transmission lines, not mowing line feeds, not mowing all the verge to a road, doing things once a year, every other year, every third year with brush hogs. Huge benefit. Whereas you can't really, it's difficult to plant your way out of it except in your yard. So your yard is about planting things, but don't forget to work with where you work and municipalities. Here is where I live, and so I live and it's almost an extreme environment, right? I have all kinds of wild beds of different kinds, but I keep it acceptable, let's call it. And people have studied this. All my pathways are weed whacked. I have foundation plantings. I don't have just like vines crawling over my house. So the rule of thumb is where your yard meets the neighbor's yard, or your yard meets a man-made structure, or your yard meets the public roadway, you got to have that trimmed, right? You could let it go. That would be good for nature, but not good for the community, because they are going to mow that area for you. And, there's just you're going to be questioned, and probably, your country club membership revoked, or all kinds of things. But what you do in a place like this is, by having a landscape where paths and other things are trimmed very closely, it says, look, I did this on purpose and I'm keeping up the deal. Look how neat and tidy that is. Like, I'm spending a lot of time on that. And then the rest of the area, you get a pass. Like, we don't know what you're doing there, but you have a lot of flowers, so you can do almost anything. So here's a different perspective on my house. And I'm mostly using the weed whacker to make paths, and I edit out plants that I don't want to see, but I'm not spending a lot of times to make it look like a formal garden. You can, that's still helpful, particularly if it's full of native plants, but you can kind of see that I have my house borders on woods, and it kind of merges in. Like, I'm feathering that back. I have shrubby stuff near the back. And so there's lots of ways to play this game. One clump of flowers. Yeah.
Sam, tell us about your roof there. Everyone's asking about your green roof you have there.
Okay. Yeah, that's so I have an entire other life of natural home building. So that's a straw bale house of a couple different kinds of construction types, because we're always messing around. And the green roof is a standard in the green roof industry kind of green roof, and it has alliums in it. It's not visible in this picture, but because that was several years ago, but there was a little tiny Virginia pine on that roof, and now it's about 6 feet tall. And I keep waiting for it to fall over or die, but it doesn't. And I'm like, you go. So it gets also, it's very dry, obviously very dry, very hot, and there's sedums and other things in there. So it can be, so think rocky landscapes, and the kinds of things that, like sedums, that like to exist in exposed, terrible to no soil kinds of spots. And those are the kinds of things that grow there. I'm not going to say it's completely native plants, but it does have a component. It was more just to have like roofs are negative space almost always in terms of biodiversity. Here's one that's not, right? So that works really well. And there are people who have, I don't know the details, I don't even know where to point you, but there are people now developing strictly native plantings for these kinds of structures. And you can retrofit roofs too in this way. But this landscape is designed to be flowing. I'm constantly changing it. I go in there regularly. I'm doing it this winter, ripping out whole sections and moving plants around. But that's works for me. And so I'm just giving you some alternatives. Here is something that no one would ever think of, right? So you can see on the left, gravel parking lot. Literally for years, anything horrible that you can think of, those are all weeds. The section on the right was that same gravel parking lot. And what we did is I had our facilities people go rototill it really quickly. All of the weeds were still there, but we dumped 8 to 12 inches of arborist chips. So these are the things that tree companies grind up a tree. They have a bunch of chips. They don't know what to do with it. And in urban areas in particular, we arranged to have them dumped here for free. And then we dumped them. And then we just planted clumps of plants in there and walked away. No watering. Once a year, I pull out the weeds. But that plants in there are basically native thugs. So these are plants like Jerusalem artichoke, wing stem, mountain mints, and several others, even blue mistflower. They will muscle them out, most of the non-native plants, all by themselves. And so there are weeds in there, but the predominant visual is native plants in an environment that is basically throwaway environment. And it just demonstrates how easily you can flip these areas. So we're big, and I'll show you a couple more things here. Here, for example, is at my house. I let the grass, air quote, grow in this one section that I wanted to make in the garden. I'm like, well, what's going to come up? And the answer is not much. You can see Virginia creeper in the front, and there's an aster in the back. And I'm like, not good enough. So I weed whacked it, which now we don't tell people to do. So now we say, just go straight to chip. Just drop chip right on all that grass and everything else, because they can't push through like the fact that there was long grass in that area doesn't make that grass able to push through that amount of chip any better or worse. And you might as well leave it in. So several advantages. One, no cardboard, no newspapers, no rototilling, no stripping off the sod, no disturbance of the soil, even though it's not great soil to begin with. And all the carbon from the plants that were there, the long leaves and their roots, then becomes part of the cycling of the nutrients, then the attraction of the fungal and bacterial communities that begin to chew that up and essentially rototill the soil underneath eventually. And then you can plant the day you drop that chip on there, plants. And as long as the root ball is, this is our advice. As long as the root ball touches the mineral soil below, you don't have to bury it in the mineral soil like you would normally. As long as it touches in there, the environment at the soil chip boundary is constantly moist, and the plant will throw roots down and also out among the chips, and the chips are going to decompose. It's pretty magic. Now, you saw the Virginia creeper. That Virginia creeper is going to push right through, and so periodically I just chop it out, and I don't try and herbicide it or anything. And again, from my point of view, it works. Here is a landscape that last year was just basically your mowed once a year, if that, kind of place, filled with poison ivy, elderberry. Some of these a lot of them are native, but then there were also a whole series of the usual suspects of vines and other kinds of invasive plants. And we just did a quick rototill to just annoy the existing very embedded perennials in there that were the ones we didn't want. And then we buried it in chip, and then we planted it these are our test beds. So we planted it in a variety of things. And I also threw in a bunch of vegetable seed because I had areas that were just chip and hadn't been planted yet for that summer, and grew all kinds of great crops. And they came in there. But this is the first year. And so I still, I guess my advice here is don't think that you can let any weeds that do get through have a pass. Like, oh, look, there are hardly any. There's just a couple blackberries, a couple of the fill in the blanks, because the soil and the conditions here are great for them also, and they're going to explode. So you have to go in and do that weeding, because I did not remove them, right? We just did a quick rototill. So they were set back, but they're going to come up. But by dint of going in periodically with, I used to use these hand, what do they call, trowels, not trowels, hand mattocks. And I just periodically chop everything down, no herbicides. Anyway, very productive at different levels. I know I'm running out of time here. Bumblebee Finder, something that we developed that helped people based on some studies that we did with bumblebees who also are picky, but are more broadly picky, to design your gardens with bumblebees in mind. And then we did studies where we looked at, well, what are the favorite plants of bumblebees in the area in the Mid-Atlantic mostly? Some of you might have participated in this. So here, right now, we're still waiting to publish this, but here's a first run. You can see at the top some, those are pretty obvious. Like, of course we knew that, but morning glories are way up there. Then at the bottom, dandelion. Well, aren't dandelions supposed to be good? Not really, not for bumblebees. And like the Susans, black-eyed brown-eyed Susan, they're not favorites. They're like if there's nothing else, I'll go to a black-eyed Susan. You'll argue because your garden is going to be different, but that's the overall pattern. And here's a bunch of things that have basically nothing. The weird one that people will point out and fixate on is the Joe Pye weed. Yeah, well, that particular cultivar, which I can't remember what it was, never had bumblebees on it for whatever reason. The others are probably like, oh, I could see that. And the rose species, those are tea roses. So next to last slide, the flowers that you plant are also attracting all kinds of other insects, supporting them, including things that eat them, leaf miners to caterpillars from moths and butterflies. So there are many, many, many benefits if you look through a different lens, a different insect lens. Like if you were working with Doug Ptolemy, he would be not talking so much about bees. He would be talking mostly about these plantings as caterpillar food. So you're serving many communities doing that. Okay, so I've probably gone over time, but this is our contact information.
This is great. And I put your link to your bumblebee flower finder in the chat there, so folks can snag it off of there.
It's pretty Googleable.
Just a couple questions for you, Sam, if you don't mind. You spoke a little bit about mason bee tubes, and folks are wondering, when is the best time to replace mason bee tubes?
Okay, this is a topic that has many levels to it. So if we look at mason bees, so there are groups mason bees are actually a commercial species. So they're commercially raised and put out into different orchards. They're great pollinators. When you do it at that scale, you have all kinds of problems that all of a sudden become problems that really aren't problems at small scales, like parasites and diseases and things like that. So you'll see lots of advice about curating your tubes and cleaning things out and that. But people are lazy, so most people are not going to do that. And so my message is each year make more tubes, put out more tubes, drill out more holes, put them out whenever you want. You can put them out in the late fall. They'll be ready to go in the spring. If you're like, oh, I've missed the spring bee season, put them out now, or not now, but yes, of course now, but put them out in summer and you'll at least get some of the summer megachiles that like to nest in tubes. And there are two components. One is if you think natural kinds of systems. One is holes in wood, so you can drill those, and the others are plant stems, and you can gather a variety of different kinds of plant stems. But as sort of the best average one are Phragmites, so common reed, and or big fountain grass or pampas grass kinds of things, and gather them when they're dead this time of year, for example. Cut them, bundle them, cinch them every foot, and take a handsaw and cut between those cinches. Now you have a cluster of potential nests. Don't worry about whether you hit the node or not. The bees will figure it out. Put out 200 nests. They'll choose the ones that are good for them.
Sounds good.
And then be creative.
So here's someone that has seen bumblebees lying on their bee balm. I'm assuming other native plants as well. They wondered if they're taking naps or what they're doing when they're just sitting still.
Yeah. So there are different kinds of stories and different kinds of situations, but many male bumblebees, for example, don't go back into a nest. Some do, some don't, and they'll just spend the night on a flower. Sometimes females, workers of a nest, will do the same sort of thing. And then the next day they'll go back for whatever reason. Maybe they got tired or they got lost. I'm not sure. Then they go back to the bumblebee colony. So it has a bunch of different ideas. And then you have bees. So bees emerge particularly later in the year, depending on the species. So sometimes later for a species is midsummer, Bombus bimaculatus, for example. And then the queens that are emerging and then the males, they're not really welcome back in the nest. And also that nest is filled with all kinds of disease and parasite loads. So they're really avoiding it. So until for a male, it's either mate and then they expire after about 3 weeks. Or for the queens, it's until they load up on enough pollen and nectar and fats to build up enough to last through the winter, and then they'll make a little hole or go under bark and then hang out until the next spring to start again.
Okay, that's good. Here's a question specifically about crab apples. What native varieties of crab apples produce the best food for bees and pollinators?
Yeah, so I didn't go into it very much, but native crabs, anything in the rosaceous family, which would include a lot of our fruits, so brambles, so blackberry, raspberry, hawthorns are a great tree for this, but cherry and several other kinds of things that would include apple and crab. Crab and apple are both in the genus Malus. They're what we call party plants. So they don't, very open architecture, pollen and nectar, very easy to access. They're basically saying, we want everyone to come, as many as possible, and we'll just get pollinated. And so, unlike many other plants whose strategy is to restrict the pollinator community as much as possible to just the ones that they favor, and they're putting in poisons and secondary compounds and things that make feeding off them unattractive and outright, will kill the young of the bees that use it that aren't used to it. These plants are open access. So, for example, having an apple tree in your backyard is doing basically as much as having a native crab. So the trickier things are the ornamental crabs and the ornamental cherries, because you're not quite sure what they did to make it that, color, shape, size, or whatever. But it's not to produce fruits. So some of those ornamentals can be quite good, and others are like, it's gone. The system has been too corrupted. But if it's producing fruits, whatever it is, plums are also good, then that should be planted. So if you want to find out the native crabs, you can go to something like iNaturalist, but also BONAP. So that's botanical. What does that stand for? It's North American botanical. Anyway, they have mapped out all the plants of North America, weeds or not, and they state whether it's an introduced one or not. So you can just look up Malus on there, and they show you all the maps. If you do Malus BONAP, then the first link you'll get, because I do this all the time, is going to be the individual set of maps for that genus, and you can tell by the color that's being presented whether it's native or not native. There's, I think, maybe 3 species of native crabs. So, yeah.
It's BONAP is the Biota of North America program. Biota.
There we go. Yeah.
I'll
Great.
drop that link in the chat here too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, last question, and it's probably because I'm kind of curious too, and I shouldn't even preface this with, I wonder if you have an opinion on bee condominiums.
Right. So essentially, you're looking at what we were talking about before, which is providing nest tubes or things, right? But they are usually commercially made, or you can make them with plants. Fine. It's to the bee, they don't care whether it looks like a little house or it has 50,000 or one hole in it. They'll use it. But like I mentioned before, it's don't get obsessed about there's too many in one place or something like that. There are so many bees out there, and there's so many circumstances, and there's so many alternative places for them to nest. You are not going to turn the ship of population increase or decrease with what kind of nesting structure you provide, but you certainly can really learn a lot by watching it. So I tell people, drill a bunch in an end of a 4x4 cutoff and put it by the kitchen window, and you will be amazed by how many things are coming and going, and you want to watch it. You don't make something and then stick it in the way in the back and then later go like, oh my gosh, look at all the holes have been closed up. You want to put it in a place on the front porch. My elderly neighbor, each year I have to create a new set of 4x4s is what I use, and put it on her porch, literally adjacent to her rocking chair. And she just loves watching them come and go. And that's the key. The key is to use it as an educational enjoyment, learn something tool.
I know, and that's what all of our gardens are about. I just love the growing season and just watching what's coming and going. So
yep. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sam. If we didn't get to your questions live, we'll try to answer them via email later. But did you have something more to add, Sam?
Sorry, were you talking to me?
Did you have anything more you wanted to add? I feel like I cut you off.
No.
Oh,
nope.
Okay. Sorry.
I can talk forever, so I think we're good. I thought it wrapped at just an optimal time.
Yes, it did. It was good. Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you, David, for your presentation on honeybees. And anyone that is interested in tomorrow's presentation, I'll be back online live at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And we're going to welcome Dr. Jared Barnes, and he's going to be presenting on how to use the science of plant survival strategies for a healthier garden. So see you tomorrow. Okay. And thank you, Sam. Have a great day.
All right. You guys too. And thanks.